Okay, guys. So, hello everyone. Hi, welcome. I'm just going to give a little talk now, just a brief little opener before we start our breakout, and you can just carry on with your great conversations that you had before. So basically the format of this group here, we've had 2 events so far. The last one was last month, and we talked about Descartes then, Cartesian thought, and in continuation of that we're going with David Hume. About half a century later, a little bit more than that, the empiricist, a voice for empiricism, now that we've had a voice for rationalism. And quite often these are put almost like 2 sides of a spectrum. Some people might argue against that, but quite often empiricism is put across from rationalism, and I'll get into why, and I'll get into what each position stands for. Make a little bit of reference back to Descartes as well that we talked about previously. So anyway, welcome to our new guests that might have arrived, and welcome to those of you that have been here before. My name is Kim, I'm the host of the group, and we'll try and make these groups here, these meetings, monthly. So next month I'm probably going to talk about a different philosopher. As I mentioned to some of you already, I'm digging up my old university books that I read 10 years ago as a student and trying to relearn them and refresh my memory here and get back into it. So the one we're going to talk about today is David Hume, but feel free for when we break out to use him as a springboard for other conversations, because the things that he talks about could lead in many different directions, and you're completely free to choose those directions as you so please. So I'll just give you about 20-30 minutes of an introduction of him and some of his main philosophies, what we're focusing on there. We've just taken a snippet because he was another prolific writer. Like many of the great philosophers of the Western tradition, he wrote a lot, so there's a lot of things we could get into. The book we're focusing on today is called A Treatise on Human Nature. And to sum up his project there, he wanted to take the scientific approaches that have been so effective in describing the physical world. So he wanted to follow in the footsteps of people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, and thought he could apply those same principles to understanding human nature, the human mind, and how people work, basically. And he wanted to distance himself from philosophers that had these idealistic notions of what people should be, and how people often seem to fail to live up to those ideals or those ideas of people. And he wanted to turn the attention on looking at how people actually operate and how they actually work, and then start from there. So for those of you that heard about Descartes last time, you probably have heard me mention that he starts from the inside and he's trying to go outside to talk about the outside world from there. And in a way you could compare their projects. You could compare them as trying to find certain philosophical ground or certain epistemological ground. Now for those of you that don't know that word, there's no need to be intimidated by it. As another great philosopher has mentioned, that I'm stealing this from Michael Sugro, epistemology is just a little bit of thinking about thinking. It's basically when a philosopher tries to go in and clarify how is our thinking working and what can we say about the thinking. So it's a bit of thinking about thinking. It's trying to tell something about what can we actually know and what are the principles we're using to have as our foundation of knowledge, right? How can we actually know anything? That's epistemology. Descartes, he thought we couldn't rely on the outside world. There's too many instances where you're tricked by the outside world, so how can you rely on them? You know, too many times you see something that turns out not to be the case, or you are fooled by what your senses tell you or what other people tell you. So we have to find something that's true no matter what. And he comes to his famous line that you've probably heard, cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. So he comes to the only solid foundation he can find is I'm thinking, I'm a thinking being, I exist. That much must be true. And then I can build from there. Now many people have criticized him for then having his argument falling apart and not knowing what to go from there, or that it becomes a little bit patchy after that. Because he's trying to use God as the big, as the big safekeeper for knowledge. It's like, well, God ordained things to be this way. But that was Descartes, that's a different talk. Hume goes the complete opposite direction. So I think a good way of seeing Hume's project is he's trying to achieve the same thing as Descartes. He's trying to find some epistemological ground of being able to say, how do we know anything about anything? Where is our knowledge coming from? You know, how can we rely on, how can we say that it's moral to do one thing and not another? Or how can we be sure that one thing will follow another thing? But instead of starting on the inside and saying, I know I'm a thinking being, he starts from the outside. He says, I know the physical world is right here. How do I know it? Well, when I get hungry, you won't find me going into a philosophical debate about whether I'm hungry. I'm gonna go get a sandwich, right? So see him as very commonsensical, getting back to basics, getting back to our experience. So he wants to focus on the experience and the outside world, and then try and go inwards from there. Hi, Roger. So, should be able to grab a chair around here. Yeah, grab that. So that was really his project. He was trying to find some solid ground, but he was starting from the outside. And that's a good way to look at it. And it's also a good way to distinguish between the Cartesians. Cartesian is just the Latin name for Descartes. So people that follow in the footsteps of Descartes are called Cartesians. So that's where that name comes from. But you can see it as trying to achieve the same thing, but from different ends of the line, if you will. Rationalists will start with the mind and rational thinking. Empiricists will usually start with the outside world and what they can actually see and touch and verify. So David Hume, he lived from 1711 to 1776. A lot of his time was spent in Edinburgh, Scotland, so he's considered one of the great Scottish philosophers, probably the greatest of them all. He was a historian, economist, and essayist as well. And he's mostly known for his empiricism and his skepticism. But also, he's got a fair bit of utilitarianism to him. And I'll get into some of these concepts here as to what they mean. So, the skepticism part is starting to draw everything into doubt. And those of you that were for the Descartes talk, you would have heard how Descartes, he used a methodological skepticism. He started drawing everything into doubt around him. So he was like, okay, I can't rely on anything. What can I then rely on? And Hume is doing a bit the same thing. But he is drawing the skepticism about many of the reasonable things we take for granted. Such as reason is being drawn into doubt, such as morals, and also many of our other notions that start from in here, if you will. The Treatise on human nature was his first major philosophical work, and he wrote it in his 20s, mid-20s. And later on, as we talked about already previously, he repudiated it later on. He vehemently said, don't read a treatise on human philosophy, read the inquiry instead. I've fixed up my argument much more compared to that last one. But a lot of universities, a lot of academics still read a treatise of human nature and actually focus on that. And book one of that is one of the most read texts of Hume today as well. So that is the part of a treatise of human nature I'm focusing on. I'm just focusing on book one, because you could also get into book two and you could get into book three. It's a long work. There's a lot you could get into there. But I'll focus on the first bit that he's talking about. It was published in 1739. So that was when he managed to publish it, and he wrote most of it in France. He spent about 3 years in France, had an unsuccessful time in law, and tried to get a little bit into business, but didn't see much effort into that. But he was excited about philosophy, so he dedicated much of his life, at least, to philosophy and philosophical pursuits. And in book one, he writes about the origin of ideas, and it's sort of the bedrock of the rest of his philosophical system. So he was trying to lay out the groundwork for his philosophical system there. And then one of the main things it goes into is impressions and ideas. There's another philosopher that's mentioned, Locke. Locke was the reigning philosopher of his time. And many people were Lockeans, if you will, and went with him. Who was also very much in many ways an empiricist. But Hume wanted to refine many of the things that he went into. And his notion of impressions and ideas was a way of refining Lockean philosophy. And basically what he goes into there is classifying many of the experiences we have and basically the sum of what we experience and what we take in into either impressions or ideas. Impressions are the raw visceral feelings we get or the raw experiences we get. Impressions are what you're getting right now, in this moment of seeing each other right here. You're getting sense data from the sounds, from the smells, from the sights that you see. But as soon as you close your eyes, or you were to close your ears, and you try to sort of replicate this moment here, or maybe give it 4 hours when you're back home, or you're in the train, and you're trying to think back on this event that happened here, you will be in the realm of ideas. So the impressions are the first major experiences we get. Ideas are copies, or almost reflections of them, that we create in our mind. So his argument is that impressions are stronger. Like the real zest of life and the real thing of life is impressions. That's when you don't have to work so hard about thinking about it, because you're getting the experiences directly into you. Whereas ideas, they're more vague, they're less powerful, they're less visceral. You have to work a little bit harder to reconstruct them. And from there, you can go talk about different concepts that he basically tries to boil down a lot of the ideas we have of, say, justice or morality must be based on some first very primal, very basic impressions. So he's trying to get back to the roots of our thinking. And you got to understand, this time here, he was not necessarily a popular figure. Because many people, you can see kind of the territory he's getting into here. He's starting to define human beings as very complex animals, but animals all the same. The main thing that we get are feelings and bodily sensations. And then from there, we can start to abstract into other realms and other ideas. That would not have been very popular with the Calvinists at his time. And actually, he applied for a position as a lecturer at the Edinburgh University in philosophy, but he was blackballed by the Calvinists that were the ruling power there, because they didn't much like many of his critical ideas that certainly could go against the grain of Christianity and religion, of seeing humans as the image of God. Whereas if you go more into his philosophy, you're more seeing humans as very complex, very sophisticated animals, but animals all the same. In a way, you could say he was ahead of his time, because this was well before Charles Darwin, but now we've more or less had a certain consensus that humans are to some extent an animal. We are part of the animal species as well. So in many ways you could say he was a few centuries ahead of his contemporaries. He then goes from there to start talking about causation, space and time, knowledge and probability, and the nature of causality. And then he goes into the skeptical implications of all these theories here. So basically he begins a digging project of undermining many of the things that philosophers and scholars have taken for granted. And many of them have assumed, oh, it's only reasonable to believe in causality. You can know from reason and rationale that if I take this drink and spill it aside, the drink is gonna probably splatter all over the table and go down here, right? I kind of know what will happen. But he's questioning whether, is that based on reason, or is that based on logic, or is that just based on your previous experience? Because probably, Hume would say at least, it's just your experience, it's just habit. Because you've seen it happen so many times, that's how you know. So he makes one example in his book of, imagine Adam and Eve. Imagine Adam seeing a billiard ball going to hit another ball, right? How does Adam know that when the one ball hits the other ball is going to move? Well, Adam, who's never seen billiard balls in his life, wouldn't know until he's actually seen that first instance of one ball hitting another. Whereas many people might be inclined to say, no, he can clearly assume that when one ball runs into the other, it's going to hit it, it's going to move, right? But he questions that. It's like, wouldn't Adam actually be able to do that if he hadn't that previous experience? Hume would say no. You have to build up your understanding of the world through experience, through empirical experience here. We were talking about empiricism, we're talking about things that we can confirm out there in the world. We're talking about things that we can measure, that we can see, that we can conduct science on. And that was very much part of his project. He wanted to bring philosophy into the realm of science. He wanted to replicate the great successes of Francis Bacon, of Galileo, and the whole scientific pursuit and the march of the Enlightenment, and wanted to bring that onto understanding human beings. And we could treat humans the same way, instead of having this baggage train of religion that we've had for the last thousands of years almost. So that was part of his project. And just to sum up the other parts of the treatise, in book 2, he goes from that springboard there to talk about the passions. And then he starts getting into this dichotomy of passions and reason, and he begins to undermine a lot of people's of his own time, and before that, a lot of ancient philosophy and modern philosophy would have put reason and rationale up here, passions down here, right? Many people are ruled by the passions, but that's a bad thing. Really, they ought to be ruled by their reasons. They ought to be ruled by their thinking. And part of education is learning to control your passions and think rationally and reasonably about things, right? There's a lot of ancient philosophy that comes from that, a lot of modern philosophy that's in that realm. But he starts to question that dichotomy and say, well, what if that isn't the case? What if reason actually should be subservient to the passions? And really, that seems to be the case. If you look at most human beings, they're not ruled by their reasons, they're ruled by their passions. They might rationalize their choices later on. They might come with smart reasons for why they took those choices, but usually most choices are picked on an emotional basis, on a gut basis, you might even say, or an instinctual basis, right? So you can see where he's sort of getting into here. He's also talking about complex versus simple ideas. And if you go with Hume and you accept these things, then you start putting a higher emphasis on the simpler and more raw ideas rather than complex ones. Or at least you should be able to take a complex idea and you should be able to break it down into its constituents, into its simple ideas. So he takes an example of the church. If you imagine the church as an idea, there's a lot of things packed into that idea. There's many things you can start imagining there. Start imagining the buildings, the architecture, the clergy, the history of the church, the ideology, the philosophy of them, the whole baggage of religion that comes with it. There's many, many things you can go into. But in that, just that one word, you've got all those ideas packed into one. That would be a complex idea that, according to Hume, you could break down into its simpler constituents. And then you'd be able to, and that is the only way that you can form a complex idea, is having very, very simple ideas that a child could grasp. And then being able to combine them together in something more of a complex idea. That's also why he gets into, and I think that's another great thing, because if you follow someone like Descartes, or if you go back to the ancient philosophers, to Socrates and Plato, to the ancient Greeks, say, reason is often put right next to morality. The more reasonable you become, the more clever you become, the more moral you become as well. But again, many times, and that's exactly what Hume gets into, that doesn't seem to fit in with what we experience. We meet plenty of so-called clever people, or people that are very smart, but are not necessarily good people, not necessarily very moral people. And then again, you might meet the village fool, the one that you'd call the idiot, or the child, or people that we would say, these people are not as clever as, say, some fancily educated academic, that seem to be way more moral and much nicer people. That does happen on occasion. So what gives? There doesn't seem to be a simple correlation there between reason and being a good person. And that's the sort of skepticism he's getting into, right? And you can see why he would have been a real thorn in the side of many academics at the time, because he would certainly have threatened their position and their moral superiority, and also probably class superiority of being up there, and starting to undermine that. And see why he might not have been as widely accepted as he might have been today. So book 2 is very much about the passions, and is also undermining reason quite a bit and trying to explain why people do what they do. And it goes into a lot of detail about that. It also goes into, say, the need of governments. Why do we have governments? Why do we have laws? And he talks about the perfect equilibrium, if you will, of you need a specific environment to have the need of laws. if we lived in a utopian environment with plenty of resources, all that we could want, we wouldn't have a need for laws and the government. And again, vice versa, if we lived in a completely depleted world where resources were really scant, and you had to fight for every piece of food or drink or whatever, then nobody would obey the laws. So you have to have sort of this middle ground, this moderate world for laws to be a thing or for a government to be needed in the first place. And that is basically his explanation of the kind of world that we are living in today, or that we live in as human beings. Book 3, just briefly, I'm not going into it, but there he's focusing on morals. So that's where his project has gone to the final end and he's attacking morals. Or at least he's trying to ground morals on something different than what it's usually been grounded in, which is usually being religion or divine authority, or as it became towards the Enlightenment, and through the Renaissance as well, rediscovering the Greeks, like morality being based in reason or how clever you were, basically how rational you were. So he was trying to base morality on something else. And this is where he becomes a utilitarian. Now, for those of you that don't know what utilitarianism means, it's a mode of thinking where what you're mostly concerned about is the consequences of an action and how it can maximize the good of people. So it's a very pragmatic way of thinking. How can we make people feel better? And a utilitarian wouldn't necessarily care so much about the means so much as the ends. So for them, if you have to lie or do things that are not traditionally considered moral, but you actually get better outcomes, then that is what you should do. That is actually the better way of going forward. But then again, you have to understand a utilitarian would still say, well, it might not be very utilitarian to start lying, because then people would start to see you as a liar, and then down the road that would give you more bad consequences. But they're coming at it from a different angle. So basically what he's summing morals up to be is, morals are good for societal integrity. It's good for making people work together. And yes, we might think it's a bit silly. We might think some religions sound a bit silly. It's a bit cute that they go to church or they do all these rituals, but it's good for keeping society together. And he wouldn't necessarily want to abolish religion because it's very useful, right? It keeps people in line and makes sure that we don't become totally barbaric and start killing each other, or the worst case scenario. So that would be a very Humean way of being a moderate skeptic, if you will. Not completely wanting to demolish everything, just allow some people to be fully skeptical and be aware that it is actually maybe a silly thing to, believe in higher ideals than the ones we can see right here down on Earth. So that's my best way of trying to introduce Hume here and his 3 different books and what he gets through on the Treatise of Human Nature. Now, I just want to give you some good quotes here as well to get us started off. But basically, what I would encourage you to do, especially if you came from the talk about Descartes, I would encourage you to try and compare and see how much do you agree that you're mostly formed by experience, or you're formed by something else. Where do your ideas come from? And here's another good question that he gets into as well, the idea of the self. Where do we have the idea of the self? Where is that coming from? And if you were to point at the self, like a proper empiricist, he would ask you, where is the self? Can you point at it? Can you tell me what it is? And usually it's very difficult. You'll say, well, I'm made up of my memories, I have this job, I'm this age, I look this way. But then he was like, yeah, no. Those are external realities. But they don't really say anything about that nexus point that they're all supposed to reference to. They're all supposed to reference to that something you. Could it be that there is no self, as we like to think of it? Could it be that we're just a bundle of emotions and sensations and thoughts and ideas that are constantly in flux and keep succeeding each other? And that really we're not much more than a complex animal that are constantly going through different phases, right? So that's another interesting question to go into, because it's completely different from the Descartesian self, from the Cartesian self that is like, no, I know that I'm true, and I know that I'm real. Even if nothing else is real, I know that I'm real. And I know because I know there is a God because I have or I can imagine there's a God. That is one of the examples that Descartes gets into. That's one of his, That's one of his safety measures for making sure that there's something grounding the self. There must be something that has put me here, because the fact that I can imagine something that should be unimaginable proves that it's there and that it put me on this earth. And you can see how it's not necessarily a very satisfying argument for many philosophers later on. But certainly Descartes' process of breaking down the world skeptically and trying to find a safe point in thinking and knowing that there is something there, at least I exist, is still something that can be applicable for today. But usually it gets a bit modified by many philosophers today if they use that as a starting point. But anyway, I digress. Let's go. I wanted to give you a couple of quotes here. In the very beginning of a treatise of human nature, he talks about the state of the sciences and philosophy today, which would be in his day in the 1700s. And it's not looking good, right? So this sets the tone for his project. He's trying to see if he can put some affairs in order here. Let's see if I can find it. Let me get there. All right. So, nothing is more usual and more natural for those who pretend to discover anything new to the world in philosophy and the sciences than to insinuate the praises of their own systems by decrying all those which have been advanced before them. Decrying means criticizing, means putting them aside, right? So here he's talking about all the other philosophers that tend to like to say, my system is great, I have found the answer now, forget about all the others that came before me. And they can easily point out all the flaws of the other philosophical systems before them. But you can hear already the kind of sarcastic tone that's coming in his writing here. Principles taken upon trust, consequences lamely deduced from them, want of coherence in the parts and of evidence in the whole, these are everywhere to be met within systems of the most eminent philosophers and seem to have drawn disgrace upon philosophy itself. So he's basically saying it's easy enough to poke holes in all the other philosophers. And in a way he's saying, I can do it very easily as well. Look, it's child's play, right? Might be a slight bit of bragging going on here. It's a little subtle bragging, but you never know. Nor is there required such profound knowledge to discover the present imperfect conditions of the sciences, but even the rabble without doors may judge from the noise and clamor which they hear that all goes not well within. There is nothing which is not the subject of debate, and in which men of learning are not of contrary opinions. The most trivial question escapes not our controversy, and in the most momentous we are not able to give any certain decision. Disputes are multiplied as if everything was uncertain, and these disputes are managed with the greatest warmth as if everything was certain. Something not quite adding up there, right? We're having a million different disputes and they only seem to be multiplying, but we talk about them as if it's dead certain. Yeah, right, this is definitely true. And he's talking both about the sciences and philosophy there. Amidst all this bustle, 'tis not reason which carries the prize, but eloquence. And no man needs ever despair of gaining proselytes to the most extravagant hypothesis, who has art enough to represent it in any favorable colors. The victory is not gained by the men-at-arms who manage the pike and the sword, but by trumpeters, drummers, and musicians of the army. Right, so he's making an analogy there. And really he's saying the state of the sciences today, it's more about sounding good. It's more about your marketing than your actual content. And as long as whatever you say sounds profound enough, then you're certain to get some acolytes, you're certain to get some disciples with you. So that was how he was viewing the sciences and philosophy of his day, and probably also how many others were viewing it. And his quest, as you can tell here, is to try and undermine some of that certainty. Try and ask a few questions like, how can you actually know many of these things here, right? And there's another little quote that I'd like to bring to you, but I'm sensing I've probably gone over time here a little bit as well. How are we doing on the time? Yeah, we're all right. Okay. So, what's that? Okay. So, another quote here, that's from his book 2, section 3. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. And he goes into a long description of how it's if you look at human beings, it's actually our emotions and our passions ruling us more than our reasons. And I think easily enough, and usually his style of argument there, he asks you to look at your own life and say, well, what are you actually driven by if you think about it really hard? And that is the question he asks us, right? If you really consider it, does your motivation come from pure rational thought, from thinking this will be the most logical solution to my problems? Usually not. Usually your goal is decided on by your emotions, by your passions, and then you find the most logical way of achieving those goals, right? That's his argument. And I think many people would probably agree with that argument there. So that's a little teaser introduction to Hume and the empirical way of seeing the world. And maybe as a final note, if you were to, he goes into an example with miracles, right? And if you were to try and postulate to Hume, there has been such a thing as miracles. Miracles did happen before. He wouldn't flat out say, no, miracles don't exist. Right? That's too blunt for him. He would rather go and say, well, if you want to be reasonable, you should probably assume from experience that it's not very likely to happen, because I've certainly never seen a miracle. You probably haven't seen a miracle. Very few people have actually experienced a miracle. And it's probably more probable that you saw something that fooled you into thinking it was a miracle, you were tricked by someone. So I'm not saying they don't exist, but it seems highly improbable that they would, right? So it's more of a bit of a caveat there. It's like, I could insist that London has suddenly started flowing up in the sky. If enough people start telling me that, I might actually start thinking, well, actually something must have happened to London. So it's a way of thinking that's open to, it's very flexible, it's very open to change. If enough things start telling you that it's the case, then you should reevaluate your epistemology or what you think is real, right? But yeah, no, I think that's mainly what I wanted to cover there, and just get that last bit in as well of him. Because there are potential flaws and there are criticisms to this way of seeing the world as well, this way of thinking about the world. That, well, say that if enough people got in on a huge scam and told you one thing was the case, should you then go along and believe them if you clearly know that it's wrong or it wouldn't normally happen? You know, that might be one of the flaws of empiricism, that you could be fooled by the outside world when you know certain things, when you know certain rational things, right?
But isn't the point not so much to criticise it, but I mean, isn't this part of this discussion between reason and empiricism that's going on? So it's not so much a criticism as how do you get to the next level, how do you get to the synthesis?
Yeah, probably, yeah, because, and that's a good point I wouldn't necessarily take on. Don't see him as someone who's necessarily all about bringing down reason, saying we can't be reasonable about anything. Because remember, he's using, to a large extent, reason to try and put some, I'd like to say he's putting some constraints on what we can say about reason, right? He's trying to limit the sphere, but he wouldn't necessarily attack and say, stop being reasonable at all costs, right? So it's more of a balancing act for him. And that is definitely characteristic of him, I find. He's a bit more moderate on that spectrum. He likes to ask questions and likes to start making you think, well, how do you know that? Or where are you basing that from? But let's just cut it here and start going into breakout groups. So now I've given you a little bit of introduction of the day, and I know it's pretty heavy philosophical topics we're getting into here, but once you start breaking them down, maybe as you would say, to their simple ideas, it's not so heavy after all. But now, that was just my little upleg here, and we can have a couple of questions coming in, and just have them for the table. It's also a bit loud, so I'll break us out fairly soon. But let's just have a couple of questions here. Yeah.
No, I'm just curious. It's the first time I've been to your nights, and
Yeah.
I'm curious how the format works.
So basically what's happening now is you can ask a couple of questions here. We can have the open forum, as it were, and then we break out into separate groups. So we start taking the tables a little bit aside. You can go over towards the sofa. You can stay exactly where you are and just start talking to people there. But you can find little groups of about 4 to 5. Something like that.
And then do we assemble again and then...
No, not necessarily. We don't assemble again. We haven't done that yet. No, we're just going to stay in this group, but try and circulate amongst the groups and see if you can. That's completely allowed to go between different groups.
So maybe try three groups. Maybe pull these chairs.
Yeah, let's pull them back a little bit there. But yeah, thank you anyway, guys. Thanks for listening to that. Cheers.
So, did he put the Hume in humanism?
The human humanism. Oh. I don't know. Did I? You tell me.
No, I mean, that was a little joke. No, we don't.